Hello. Today I'm going to talk about video games and adolescent development. As teachers, we are dealing with a lot of, especially some teens, who are playing lots of video games in their free time. And over the course of history, we have seen that violent tendencies have generally been blamed on the media, especially video games. And so what we want to look at here is not necessarily are video games impacting our children to be violent, or are video games positive? We want to kind of look at both sides and see where the research has been. So the video game industry. It's a very large industry. It's one of our top forms of entertainment, adults and children. So according to the Entertainment Software Association, the ESA, 70% of all U.S. citizens under 18 play video games regularly, and that's 1 hour or more per week. So if we have a classroom of 20 kids, 14 of them are playing a video game regularly. 80% of gamers say that video games provide mental stimulation, and 79% say they provide relaxation. 65% of gamers play with other people online. So to a lot of our teens and a lot of our children, video games are providing a social component. 55% of parents play video games once per week with their children, and 92% pay attention to which games their children play. This is really important for us to know and to understand, because it does show that a lot of parents, over half of them, are playing video games with their kids and interacting in that way with them. And the stat that I think looks really good is that 92% pay attention to which games their children play. So we are seeing that at home, parents really are being involved with their children in the video games that they play. That's not always positive, but it does show at least that parents are taking an interest in what's happening with their kids. So what is the problem? And these necessarily aren't problems, but this is just kind of what the reality is. Adolescents are spending more and more time playing video games. As we've seen, we've started kind of back in the late 70s and the 80s with the Atari and the Nintendo systems. Coming through today, where basically now you have your phones, you've got your PCs, you've got your Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo, all sorts of things for kids to be playing on. And the top 20 video games of this year include the following genres: fighting, war, sports, adventure, and creativity. The creativity genre is games such as Minecraft. Adventure would be something maybe like a Mario Odyssey. Sports, Madden, the 2K sports, as well as MLB The Show. War would be something like Call of Duty. And fighting would be something in the genre, in the vein of Mortal Kombat. But there's a problem with that. As you saw, the top two in that list are fighting and war, both of which are pretty violent. And of the top 20 games of this year, 13 contain some form of violence. Now, that violence can be pretty different. We do have some cartoon fantasy violence, would be something like a Spider-Man, something like Zelda, or a game like League of Legends, where it's not necessarily something that really translates into our lives, everyday lives. But we also have more realistic depictions of violence, such as Call of Duty, like I said, with the war, Grand Theft Auto, and Tom Clancy's The Division 2. Violent video games are ubiquitous in our society and are played by gamers of all ages. When I was teaching music, I had some teenagers who played basically all of these games, usually every day. So we see that really most of those games, most of the top 20 games, do contain some sort of violence. So do violent video games affect adolescents? Well, we have some studies on the negative effects of video games, and we have some studies on the positive effects of video games. So many studies on the negative effects of video games have relied on self-reported measure of aggressive feelings and attitudes. So these studies would ask gamers, does this game make you feel particularly aggressive or have a negative attitude? Other studies relied on teacher and peer ratings of participants. So you'd have somebody participating in the study and you'd ask their teacher and their peers, do you see an uptick in negative attitudes or aggressive feelings? But the findings of these studies have shown mixed results. So Anderson et al. found a causal relationship between exposure to violent video games and aggressive behavior. So it would show that if the teen was exposed to violent video games, there would be an uptick in aggressive behavior, but it also didn't necessarily show that that was the exact link. There were some other factors in there as well. Lemons et al. Found that frequency of gaming related from lower psychosocial well-being. So an increase in violence could not be limited to gaming frequency. So again, just like in the previous study, they were related, but there are some other aspects that were happening as well. Do gamers prefer violent video games? Looking back at the 13 or 14 of the top 20 games being violent, it does look like gamers would prefer violent video games, but there's enough diversity of genre. So for instance, sports games are the #2 most popular genre, especially among older teens. So you do have a lot of fighting games, but usually those are spread out. You have people who are really into Call of Duty. You have people who are really into Grand Theft Auto. You have people who are really into Fortnite. But those are separate pockets, whereas sports games, being the #2 most popular genre, kind of gather from all of those. So it's not necessarily that they prefer violent video games. It's just that there's more out there. But are there any positive to video games? So we're kind of leaving the violent video games, kind of seeing that there is a relationship between aggressive tendencies in video games, but not one-to-one. So we do want to look at positives because, like I said, our children are playing more and more video games. And there are studies coming out in the past 10, 15 years that are showing there are positives for adolescents playing video games. Gaming at a moderate pace has been shown to embolden emotional stability. Adolescents use video games to let off steam and relax. And additionally, adolescents have turned more and more to gaming in order to release stress in response to peer, parental, or personal problems, resulting in a positive relationship with happiness. So as we've seen, video games provide an outlet for kids and adolescents. It's not necessarily a violent outlet. Usually it's creative. There's also puzzle games that are really challenging the mind. But you do see more and more that as adolescents are going through stress, they're trying to figure out what's going on in their life, they turn to video games to kind of let that out, which is a positive. Henry Jenkins said, "The worst thing a kid can say about homework is that it is too hard. The worst thing a kid can say about a game is it's too easy." When I read this quote, it really made me think of what we are doing with homework and what video games what's happening in video games. And as I personally play a lot of video games as well, I've seen that there's a lot of mentally challenging things about video games. Of course, you do have the ones that basically are just let's put the ball on the net or let's just shoot the person. But a lot of video games require strategy. They require a lot of thinking. They require puzzle solving, a bunch of that stuff, which can translate into homework. And we kind of want to make our students blur the line between the two. We obviously see that the adolescents and our students really are up for the challenge. They're up for the challenge in the form of a video game. But they're not necessarily up for the challenge in regards to homework. So what we really want to do, we've seen the positives, we've seen the negatives of video game playing, but one of the big positives is the challenge of video games. And we want to make sure that our students can see that they can rise to the challenge in a video game and they can also rise to the challenge of homework. And we want to make sure that our homework not only is teaching them what they need to know, but we also want to make it kind of fun to have them rise to that challenge. So in conclusion, research is split on the positive and negative impact of video game playing in adolescence. As you've seen, there were a lot of things on the negative side that were like, things are going to increase violent tendencies or increase negative attributes. But you also saw a lot of things where video games are really positive for kids to kind of be social, to learn, to challenge themselves, and to let off steam. But we want to remember that exposure to negative influences can create a negative, harmful personality. But this is where it's really important to go back to that stat of 55% of parents playing video games once a week with their kids, and 92% of them being involved in what their kids are playing. Ultimately, parents, and a lot of us teachers, either are parents or will become parents as well, we need to make sure that we are filtering what our kids can play. And that's not necessarily in a content, not necessarily telling them what they can or cannot play, not censoring what they can play, but we really want to make sure that they're not being exposed to negative influences at the wrong age. We don't want our 8-year-olds playing Call of Duty. We don't want our 8-year-olds playing Grand Theft Auto. If we have a 10-year-old playing Fortnite, then maybe you have a conversation where it's more cartoonish violence, but you know that that is appropriate in the context of the game. But then we also want to be able to have our kids play video games and learn from them what they need to learn. There may be some cartoon violence with Mario jumping on a mushroom or something like that. But there's also a lot of hand-eye coordination that goes with that. And so we want to make sure as parents and as teachers, we are providing education for our kids to make sure that they know what's going on within the context of the game and what's appropriate outside of that. Because video games do provide positive attributes in adolescence and also help the brain solve complex issues and puzzles. So there is my Works Cited page. I'd like to thank you. There's a lot that we need to do with video games, but there's a lot of stigma that we need to remove as well with the violent video games. And I think the best kind of strategy for us is just to make sure that we're really being involved in our kids and our students' lives, and making sure they're educated on what they're playing, and that they know just because violence is acceptable in certain games and in certain situations in those games, it does not necessarily mean that it is acceptable in our everyday lives. And we just want to make sure that when our kids are playing video games, when our students are playing video games, we just want to make sure that they're educated the best that they can be on the positives and the negatives. So thank you very much.